So this video is going to be the first episode in a series exploring / venting at the darker sides of typology, as well as presenting the ways by which we can mitigate these darker sides towards a much more healthy, constructive and sustainable application of typology. And this first one is just going to be exploring mistyping, what it is, and why you shouldn't worry about it too much. Now, I fully understand the potential irony of making this video when I myself provide a typing service. And of course, I wouldn't be providing the service if I didn't think it was, well, a service. So yes, it is of course extraordinarily useful to get our type right. But in order to get our type right, it's necessary to take a healthy attitude towards this process of self-discovery. But unless you're providing typology services, or have built a channel around the very concept of you being one type rather than any other, you can afford more of a laid-back attitude to this entire thing. So this video is going to present to you 5 reasons why mistyping isn't such a big deal. And it can even be a good thing, a sign of growth, of understanding, of progress towards finding your actual type. And as I'm going to be getting into towards the end of the video, finding your true type isn't necessarily the most valuable takeaway from typology. First and foremost, it's important to view your type as a hypothesis, one which you are actively testing against reality. Let's say you're new to typology, you've just taken a personality test, maybe on the infamous 16 Personalities website, which by the way doesn't even assign cognitive functions, and it's not even MBTI either. It's more of a big 5 code with MBTI letters. And you've received, for the sake of argument, an INFJ result. I mean, of course you have. What other type could you be? Okay, let's dig into it. Let's see what cognitive functions correspond to this type. Let's see how deep this rabbit hole goes. Let's read some blog posts, let's watch some videos by INFJ YouTubers who probably aren't actually INFJs. And again, let's test it against reality. Based upon, let's say, introverted intuition descriptions we've got from hopefully reliable sources, let's see how this corresponds to our own cognition. Let's see how introverted intuition plays out in our own cognitive output. Because we all have introverted intuition, let's see whether or not it's actually in dominant position. Okay, so you continue testing out this hypothesis and, well, the likelihood is something's going to seem not quite right. Why is that? Well, the INFJ does actually seem to be a pretty rare cognitive type. Chances are you're probably not one. But you might be. Maybe it corresponds perfectly. Maybe you got it right the first time. Even then, as I'm going to be getting into later, you should still take the type with a grain of salt. But if something doesn't seem quite right, perhaps your insights and revelations are more dependent upon an external interaction. Perhaps you can so easily filter out external emotional information through an internal value filter as to make introverted feeling a more likely gateway function. Perhaps your style of thought is more orderly than it is industrious, divergent rather than convergent. But hey, you run with a hypothesis, you tested it out, and now you're down to 15 out of 16 types, with the INFJ being effectively eliminated. And if you find yourself using type as that kind of crutch for your identity, if you find yourself going into this community out of a desperate need to know who you are, this will invariably lead to a certain amount of cognitive bias, because rather than taking a type label with a grain of salt, you are suddenly relying upon it to serve an extremely important function within your psyche. A role that is better coming from elsewhere, because after all, cognitive type only makes up a very small portion of who you are anyway, and it should never be used as something to define who you are. You are much more than your type. And since type, especially early on in your journey, should be used as more of a hypothesis, it's generally a bad idea to take a test, get a type, and the next day jump onto YouTube creating a channel under the guise of being that type and no other. I implore people who are uncertain about their type, or still in a very hypothetical stage, not to jump on the belief wagon and start a YouTube channel under the guise of being a type you are uncertain about, or a type that you are certain about when you shouldn't be. So just to recap, until you've got plenty of information, have really explored all of the ins and outs, you should view your type as an active hypothesis. And that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with mistyping if you're testing it out as a hypothesis. It's okay for your hypothesis to be proven wrong. That just catapults you further along in your journey and brings you that step closer to finding your true type. If you thought that you were an INFJ but discovered that you aren't, that process itself probably illuminated certain cognitive preferences. So not only have you eliminated one of the 16 types, but you've also highlighted others. Congratulations, you've taken a step closer to finding your true type. And that's as a result of not taking a type too seriously. And this process may very well be aided by the input of other people. And this brings me to point number 2. It's okay to be accused of mistyping. There are many overly combative types in this community, but there are also many people who just genuinely want to help. And sometimes, even if a person does come in wielding a torch and an axe, sometimes their input is still going to be somewhat valid. No matter how self-attuned we may be, we're always going to be relying upon the objective feedback of other people. And yeah, this feedback isn't always going to be so objective, but there may still be objectivities within the subjectivity. And if you find yourself becoming disproportionately upset in response to the more diplomatic and milder statements of possible mistyping in your regard, that might be a sign that you are putting too much of your own identity and self-concept into cognitive type. And the hypothesis I mentioned earlier is very much a collective one. We rely upon our own insights as much as we do the feedback of other people. But what I've noticed tends to occur is a minority of people going into the type tend to invest too much of their own identity and subsequent emotional energies in getting it right from the get-go. And these are the people who tend to get on the back foot and defensive at the slightest accusation of mistyping. And of course, typical modern age social polarization henceforth occurs, whereby the overly defensive person causes the originally diplomatic accuser of mistyping to be equally defensive. And thus what is supposed to be a collective experiment upon a person's individual self-typing hypothesis becomes something much more toxic. And it's something of a chicken and the egg scenario, of course, because it might just as well be overly defensive people unwilling to get into a meaningful conversation about the type, causing this entire polarity. Or it might be because a significant amount of people who accuse other people of mistyping are being overly combative and zealous in doing so. And of course, the answer is usually both. But what should be occurring is a healthy cluster of individuals in the middle, who are neither totally invested in their own type, nor entirely skeptical and zealous as to the mistyping of another person. What you have in the middle here is a conversation, and what you have in the polar extremes is a war. But as part of healthy discourse within this community, every now and again, maybe once every 2 weeks, maybe once a month, heck, maybe a few times a week, you might get some input as to your cognitive functions that run contrary to your own hypothesis. And sometimes it might be nonsense, and sometimes it might be truth. And other times it might be somewhere in between. And in becoming less defensive about our own types, taking the opinions of others on board with a little bit more grace and patience even, you will in doing so have beneficial ripple effects upon a community at large. Because the less people getting defensive about the type, the less people getting combative about mistyping. And the solution to this leads me to point number 3. Stop taking this whole thing so damn seriously. And that applies to both the typed and the typist. Because letting go of our emotional attachment to our type allows us to enter meaningful conversation with other people without it causing some kind of conflict. And there's a certain irony to letting go of one's type, to letting go of typology altogether. When one no longer takes this sphere, this early science, as seriously as one might before, suddenly the entire community can be elevated, suddenly conversation can be elevated, suddenly data becomes more reliable, suddenly cognitive bias slightly falls out of the picture. And when we can more reliably test our own respective hypotheses against the hypotheses of other people, we can elevate ourselves and the community as a whole, and make even more meaningful discoveries along the way. With a healthier community not taking type as seriously and entering a more healthy discourse with each other in regards to typing versus mistyping, we'll suddenly have a community which is much more accessible and less elitist, thus allowing the popularity of these cognitive function-based models to grow even further. And we'll also have a community generating a much healthier product of the system. And when a healthier product is generated, the systems as a whole will be held in much higher repute by, say, more academic communities. And a community where we can all meet in the middle without becoming defensive in one direction or another one is one where we can make much more meaningful discovery and cement important conversational pathways between potentially conflicting communities and systems that will allow all systems and communities to grow and benefit from one another. And think of these pathways as trade networks, if you will, because there is a tendency here for isolated systems to become commonplace. A person who is overly zealous about their own type and stubbornly resistant to any contrary input from other people is an isolated system, and these isolated systems will exist within other isolated systems. Think a mistyped INFJ, of which there are many, existing within an INFJ only community. But another form of isolated system is the person who believes they have all of typology under the belt, their understanding of cognitive functions is superior to that of everybody else's, and therefore whenever they happen to accuse another person of mistyping, it is not open to discussion. And this system is equally isolated because the person is not opening the floor to discussion. They are simply hitting other people over the head with a mistype hammer. And of course, these individuals also exist within their own particular isolated systems, oftentimes a community built around certain typological interpretation that believes this system is the way, it is the truth, and all other systems are heretics. And so a person can be as much an isolated system here as a typological system itself. And the more we can foster meaningful conversations between each other, the more that systems can communicate and learn from each other, without becoming overly self-righteous or holier than thou. And using a trade network analogy here is very helpful to see how all of us benefit from continued interaction and sharing of our own individual perceptions. It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to be wrong about your type. It's okay to be wrong about another person's type. It's okay to be wrong about a cognitive function definition within your system of choice. It's okay to be wrong in general, because being wrong affords you the opportunity to be more right. For as long as you are using such things as opportunities to advance your own understanding and the understanding of other people, then having all of these hypotheses we are collectively testing out, proven null, proven incorrect, is great. That's what we're looking for. We're looking more for contradictions than we are validations. So let's talk, let's have conversations, let's learn from each other, let's learn from conflicting systems. Things here are not either right or wrong. You will always be finding wrongs within the right and rights within the wrong. And taking that back to mistyping, if we're not taking this whole thing too seriously, then we won't take individual comments too seriously either. For example, as a YouTube creator, I might get a little bit of constructive criticism every now and again. Well, if I only ever receive a piece of criticism one time out of, let's say, thousands of comments, I'm not going to take that criticism very seriously because it has a low probability of being a representation of my target audience. But if suddenly, time and time again, let's say there were many instances of this very same criticism voiced by different people, then I'll have to take that criticism to heart. Because it means there's something I can improve upon that would give my audience a better experience. And you can view type and typological disagreements with a similar kind of perspective. And following on from that, a major reason why you shouldn't take all this too seriously is that type itself appears to be more spectral anyway. There aren't actually 16 types of people walking around. And these 16 categories we're all employing are nothing more than heuristics. They are simply averages, trends of cognitive individual variation. No one INFP will be the same as another, even cutting out the nurture from the nature versus nurture dichotomy. Everyone's type will still be different. Everyone will have a unique brain. And for ease of reference and measurability, we simply divide this sphere into 16 slices. And you can divide these slices as many times as you want. I mean, every time you do so, it becomes harder to reference and harder to gauge. It doesn't change the fact that no person will be the same as another one. And even though I use a type spectrum model and I do suggest people leaning in one direction over another one, generally we should continue to stay within these 16 categories. Because the more you try and narrow a person down into a very specific portion on the type spectrum, the less you account for natural cognitive fluidity. Type is fluid. It's context dependent and it's time dependent. As different circumstances pop up, our cognition has to change in order to accommodate them. Just because extroverted thinking isn't exactly my forte doesn't mean I can't switch into a cognitive modality better suited to it. And the difference between me and my primary modality and That extroverted thinking centric modality would be like night and day if you're gauging my own competency. Heck, it's still not going to be as competent as a person who inhabits an extroverted thinking centric modality more often than I do. But it's still going to be better than whatever this is. Our cognition shifts with time and context as we accumulate new experiences, move closer or perhaps further away from individuation. Our cognition expands. Perhaps we don't necessarily change our position on the type spectrum, but we encompass more of it. And viewing your type in a fluid manner, in knowledge of your natural predisposition towards a kind of default state, also observing your natural oscillation between that and other ones. It again allows you to use your type or proposed type in a more healthy manner, because it's no longer telling you what you should or should not be doing, what you can or cannot do. It's simply proposing to you the different gateways and pathways through which you can access different cognitive modalities. Become more than your type. Which leads me to point number 5. Ultimately, cognitive functions are what matter the most here. Being aware of how we are operating in the moment. Being aware of how we operated a few hours ago. Anticipating how we might be operating in the future when our circumstances change. And seeing these modes of operations as more fluid and not contained within this extremely niched down operating system. I know it's something of a cliche, but we really do all have all cognitive functions. And you don't need to know your type in order to use these cognitive functions, or even to understand how to use them. Recognizing the law of opposition that exists between one function and another one attitude and another one. Recognizing that when you are using your extroverted thinking convergently, you will be simultaneously using your introverted feeling divergently. That is, abiding by your own internal desires and values in order to implement effective change within the external world. You don't need to know your type to observe that's what's going on. And you don't need to know your type to know that in order to render extroverted thinking more cautious and divergent, observational, one renders one's introverted feeling convergent. One adapts one's identity. One reevaluates and perhaps even reforms one's belief system. And similarly with extroverted sensing, if one were using it convergently, one would be interacting with the external concrete world in a highly specific and focused, tangible manner. And introverted intuition would therefore, within this situation, be more divergent, abiding by a vision, abiding by aggregate internal understanding. And again, you don't need to know your type in order to know what codec lens pairing you're using. What is the rational nature of a perceiving function? What is the perceptual nature of a codec function, a judging function? Is my introverted sensing right now pertaining more to hard truths, file systems, refined definitions, in an introverted thinking manner? Or is it more reflective, recalling of meaningful past experiences, concretizing of self-concept, in a more introverted feeling-like manner? Simply using cognitive functions as a frame of reference to understand who you are right now, what you are doing right now, can allow you to both understand how to operate differently in the moment, either from changing context or changing your adaptation to it, and also allow you to go on to collect the data over time that you need in order to find your type, in order to find this consistent cognitive predisposition. What cognitive pairing of what particular attitude is most consistent here? What are the paths of greater resistance? Why do I keep defaulting to a subpar cognitive modality when another cognitive modality, such as one more extroverted thinking centric in my case for example, might be more optimal for the circumstances? And this leads me to a kind of bonus point, I suppose, wrapping it all up. A major reason why mistyping is generally okay, or not even being a type to begin with, is because the best type is in fact no type. Why would you want to have limitations? It's useful to have strengths, of course it is, but in building upon our weaknesses as well, we can further support our strengths. Generally, a healthier brain has more neuroplasticity. If we rely too much upon our types to tell us who we are, what we can and cannot do, we're preventing ourselves from taking on new perspectives, and we're preventing ourselves from growing. When I say the best type is no type, I'm not talking about being some kind of superhuman, all types at the same time kind of thing. The law of opposition makes that impossible. But just as with the trade route analogy I used earlier, this applies to your own cognition as well, the relationship between your own cognitive functions. If you can establish meaningful trade networks across your entire brain, then the cognitive functions within your mind can work alongside each other rather than being at odds. If we use these cognitive functions as Jung himself intended, as a means towards individuation, the unification of opposites, then we are no longer limited by type. We are recognizing perhaps where we are right now. We are recognizing our own predispositions and all of these wonderful things that make us a unique human being, that enables us to do the things that we can do. And there's a beauty in that. But seeing type as something to be expanded allows us to keep growing. It allows us to build upon our strengths. It allows us to become more cognitively well-rounded. And really allows us to get the most out of typology. It allows us to use all of these different systems towards the continued betterment of self and other. So is it okay to mistype? Absolutely. Is it okay to be wrong about a cognitive function? Definitely. Is it okay to be misunderstood by someone every now and again? Of course. That'll go on to refine your own communication and their own understanding. And if you do find your type eventually, try to be balanced in your perspective of it. It's not about your type being something to be ashamed of or something to be proud of. It gives you a lot to celebrate, and it gives you something to work on as well. And you are under no ethical obligation to overcome your type. But type or no, using cognitive functions with a growth mindset, however amazing you might already be, it just allows you to be that much more than what you currently are. And ultimately, just have fun with them. Cognitive functions are awesome. They're this cool little framework, this user interface that you can use in order to better understand what you're currently doing, what another person is currently doing, and why. And even more excitingly, at least for me anyway, seeing what cognitive functions you could be using instead of your current ones in response to any given set of circumstances. It gives you something to play around with. It gives you something to tinker upon, optimize. And it allows us to see these cognitive faculties that we may previously have thought ourselves to have no control over as things that we can control, as parameters we can mold and shift to give ourselves and other people a more meaningful experience. And you don't need to know your type in order to use them. Type serves more as a kind of reference point for your natural magnetic pull towards some functions over other ones, towards some attitudes of functions over other ones. But it does not define who you are or what you can do. But it can partially define at least how you can do what you want to do, how you can be who you want to be. And that's why I like to refer to the cognitive stack of other systems as a cognitive map within CPT. Because in many ways it is a map. It's a map towards self-fulfillment. It's a map towards effective adaptation. What function should I go into in response to this particular stimuli? And what is the pathway I need to go down in order to activate this new modality? And it just makes life a little bit more interesting. And that concludes the video. So thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. You were awesome. And if you know anybody who you think might benefit from the contents of this video, be sure to share it with them. I'd absolutely love to know everything that you think about this topic down in the comments below, particularly as to your own thoughts on your own typological journey and the degree to which cognitive functions alone have been useful in your life. Kind of ironic putting this in the midst of a It's Okay Not to Know Your Type video, but if you are interested in charting your current position on the type spectrum, knowing your own individual cognitive type, I do recommend checking out the CPT type service. And if you're interested in employing these cognitive functions towards continued self-growth and actualization, and would like to expand your type towards individuation, I do provide type coaching as well. So that is it for me, and I'll be back in a week or two. For now, take care.